Welcome to the reality show, day 102 of the war in Israel. We've been talking about South Africa in recent days uh, due to the International Court of Justice case against Israel uh, brought by South Africa. So I'm joined today by Marco and Richard, and I believe it's your first time on the channel, right? Chris Hadding, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Chris is the executive director of the Center for Risk Analysis in South Africa. Um, how's everybody doing?
Good, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, all
Cool.
things considered that I have to be the South African voice, I guess not too bad.
Well, I'm assuming you're not going to be the ANC voice. That's
Yeah, no. I don't think they have enough money to pay their salaries, never mind pay me, so no concerns.
Well, I mean, so I've been following a little bit in recent days what's been going on and trying to educate myself a bit about his. Part of it is we talked about South Africa and we saw how many people are in the comments or in the chat from South Africa. I then looked at the statistics. We had one show where like a third of our viewers were from South Africa. So there's we've been talking about how in Gaza there's, as far as we can tell, no real opposition to Hamas, and in South Africa there is very real opposition to the ANC, not just on this, but generally, and it's because, yeah, prior to recent events, when we hear about things, when we hear news from South Africa, it's not good news, and if you deflect to an enemy far away who you can blame for things, that's helpful in having people kind of ignore what it is that's being done. So Chris, by the way, another thing that people have said is, don't say South Africa, say ANC. Look, the whole "not my president" thing is not a real thing. It's not, if Jeremy Corbyn won an election here, he'd be the prime minister of the UK. He'd be, my prime minister, at least for a few weeks or a month until I get my affairs in order and get out of here. But yeah, that is what it is. So sorry, we know there are good people in South Africa who oppose the ANC, but they are your government. So Chris, do you want to just give us a general overview of what the situation is in South Africa, and in relation to Israel and this court case?
I definitely think trying to focus on foreign policy is trying to deflect from the ANC's own shortcomings in South Africa. So, for example, an over 40% unemployment rate on the expanded definition, youth unemployment around 60%, GDP growth over the last 5 years averaging 1% if we're lucky, and that was before COVID. So obviously COVID lockdowns wrecked many economies, but South Africa was weak going into that because of the ideological and policy decisions of the ANC government. The ANC government been in power since 1994. Progress between 94 and 2007, rollout of services, protection of individual rights, not to the extent that we would want, but to a better extent than there was during apartheid, of course. And then from 2007 up until 2022-23, through the Zuma administration and then Cyril Ramaphosa, who campaigned on the idea of a new dawn, revival, progress, that sort of thing that hasn't materialized. The ANC has now very much focused on extractive policies and politics. So the veneer of progress, but actually it's all about political connections, what we can extract, what you can do, your friends, you look after your friends, that kind of thing. I think that's become the overriding focus, along with the ideology of sort of collectivism and statism, where the ANC is enlightened enough to lead 16 million South Africans to a glorious future if only we give them enough power, as it were. So that's the context from at least 2007. I mean, within that, the average South African is frustrated with the status quo. Service delivery is declining. Things like electricity, of course, with the periodic load shedding, as we call it here, or blackouts, that continues. Water infrastructure is becoming a bigger issue. Basic service delivery that one might take for granted, like waste collection. In Johannesburg, where I'm based, at this time of year, more rain, and when infrastructure isn't maintained, for example, waste, refuse collection, the clearance of drains, that kind of thing, floods can occur. And it's all within the government's power to deal with these issues, but the focus just isn't there. So I think this radical shift towards foreign policy where South Africa, the government hasn't necessarily tried to play this role before. I mean, with someone like Bashir, when he was in South Africa, the government was requested to arrest him, didn't. So they've always shied away from moving into strong positions in foreign policy. And I think in the context of the elections coming up later this year, national and provincial, they're trying to curry some favor where possible, either internationally or locally. And then just the last point on the ANC itself as an organization, periodically over the last 2 years, has struggled to even pay salaries of party representatives, issues around registration, conflict between the national executive committee of the ANC versus the provincial body. So in Gauteng, again, where I'm based in Johannesburg, there's differences between what the party thinks provincially in terms of working with someone like the Economic Freedom Fighters versus what the national body believes. So rising tensions there. So you've got an inability to pay salaries, tensions around who we should work with or not. And I think they're trying to win wherever they can with something like, oh, we're now going to take a stand, quote unquote, for Palestinians in Gaza, use the rhetoric, all that kind of thing. And just finally, on the funding point, this hasn't been confirmed, but there have to be questions raised around, for a party that couldn't pay salaries periodically, that had a court case against it around party paraphernalia and campaign paraphernalia from 2019, that election campaign, where is the funding coming from? Is it coming from potentially Iran? Is it coming from Russia? There's, again, the rhetoric that the ANC is close to a country like Russia, the former Soviet Union, struggle veterans and all that, noble quote unquote rhetoric, but maybe it comes down to purely pragmatic payment.
Yeah, thank you, Andreo, for the super chat. Andreo says looking forward to this show, and his super chat is 140 South African Rand, which is the best named currency without a doubt anywhere in the world. Marco.
Yeah. For people who don't know much about the ANC was the party which effectively fought off the apartheid regime and eventually in '94, Nelson Mandela, who was the president of the CEO, whatever, the chairman, became president of South Africa. But this is the result of a dialogue which probably started in the '70s, which culminated with the end of the apartheid. And that in itself was a good thing. The bad news that the only good thing stopped there. Since then, South Africa, which was the crown jewel in the crown of Africa, has been going downhill at an alarming speed. The ANC, of course, was the party, was a very communist party. It was a very strong link with the KGB and therefore USSR, and it had very strong links to all communist parties at the time in the '70s and '80s during the Cold War. And of course, because of that, they also had very strong party with the PLO and all the anti-Israel goons out there. Saying that I'm not the ANC, it's not South Africa. It's a bit a stretch, because the ANC actually has a 60% majority in parliament. So when you try and dissociate it from the people in South Africa, well, unless they're all printed out votes, which is, it's not totally impossible, but not all of them will be fake. You cannot say that the people in South Africa do not support ANC. The African National Party is currently led by Ramaphosa, who succeeded a major crook, who was the president from 2009 to 2018, Jacob Zuma. Zuma actually was kicked out from being vice president because of corruption, but then he managed to become president immediately after. So that gives you a sense of kind of politics in South Africa. And about foreign policy, since 2010 under Zuma, the ties with Africa, with China, got really strong. There was an accord with what was his name, the Chinese president at the time, which eventually culminated in the creation of the so-called BRICS, which is the economic group of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the bad letters in this acronym is R and C, really. After the Russian attacks on Ukraine, South Africa, the immediate response was, "Oh, you should withdraw immediately." And within a few hours or days, they moved to the neutral camp. So much so that in December 22, a Russian ship was seen outside Cape Town loading weapons for Russia. Of course, an internal investigation of the most corrupt government in the world came out saying, no, that wasn't the case, but good luck to that.
I think I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Chris said in there. One, let's take the currency as an example, the Rand itself, which has been depreciating enormously over the past few years, is now between, I can't remember the exact figure, we're about between 18 and 19 Rand to the dollar at the moment. And even before COVID, and certainly over the period of Zuma and more recently Ramaphosa, it's been getting worse and worse as a reflection of the country. And another way of presenting the statistic, which you mentioned earlier, which was the GDP growth in the world. South Africa last year was 171st in the world. And across the last 5 years, 151 came in the world, which goes to show how much it's on a decline at the moment. I think you mentioned the point about South Africa going to the International Court of Justice on a basis of trying to get things back from other people, the kind of favor type mechanism that is taking place on the international stage. And that reflects kind of the culture that operates at national level, doesn't it? It reflects the nepotism, the kind of bribery and corruption that goes on all the time. If you're always promoting people based on nepotism, for example, or based on people having fake education certificates or fake credentials, or because they're the friend of somebody, or because they're promoted for other factors other than their merit, then all that does is lead to a culture of incompetence at best, which is then leads to the decline in how the country is maintained and managed, whether that's in a public sector or the private sector, if they've got such an influence over people like the energy supplier Eskom, for example.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. By the way, I see Christopher Smith in the chat saying something about Justin Trudeau. Don't worry, we're on every day. We will get to Justin Trudeau. Yeah, we'll get to Canada as well. Yeah, Chris, a few years ago there was a mayoral election in London, and one of the candidates, I was watching something he said, and he starts off by saying, "I'm the anti-woke candidate," and this was his whole campaign. I'm anti-woke. That's my. This was like the essence of his campaign, and I thought, I can't possibly be accused of being pro-woke, but if the first word of how you define yourself politically and why people should vote for you is anti, that's not a great selling point. And yeah, I knew immediately I wasn't going to vote for this guy. Now, apartheid was evil. That's absolutely, an evil system, a racist system. And to some extent, you can understand why people would just join anything to oppose it. But to what extent was there any positive in the ANC at any point that was not anti a bad thing?
I think under Nelson Mandela's leadership, there was an element of, we realized that the state-centric model that apartheid wasn't working, not for all the citizens at least. So it was extractive, and it did work for the minority of the population. And there you can reallocate resources, you can impose subsidies for state-owned entities like Eskom was at the time. Eskom was one of the best performing companies in the world, but it was also protected by the government, regardless of how it actually functioned or not. And then the ANC government had to deal with the benefit of that. So the debt to GDP ratio was incredibly high in 94, the deficit. And the ANC at that time, there was no doubt the ideological component. So the ANC pushes what's called the National Democratic Revolution, where it is the vanguard of the revolution. It needs to transform society. You've got the idea of radical economic transformation to seize state resources and levers of the state to benefit the majority and redistribute wealth and all that sort of thing. So it was coupled, the ideology, with a sense of maybe an element of we need to implement some sort of pro-market reforms after apartheid. So liberalize labor markets, introduce competition in things like aviation, in things like transport, in things like electricity. Not that that has happened. There was a realization they needed to do that, but there's still no competitor to Eskom. It's a monopoly, state-backed monopoly in electricity generation, which is part of its many problems. So I think there was this sort of conflict the whole time between, yes, we want to control the state and transform society from what it was, but also we kind of need the private sector to function. We need to collect tax revenues. So we'll begrudgingly let the private sector sort of function. It was never, let's do it for the right reasons. It's sort of, let's do it very pragmatically. And I think the seeds were sown for the Zuma administration and Ramaphosa during the time of Mandela and Mbeki, because even then things like cadre deployment, that idea of nepotism, appointing political people to positions on state-owned companies and also in the private sector through things like broad-based black economic empowerment, through affirmative action. Those are ways to try and control things in the public and the private sector. So you can consistently have these tensions. And because you had those sort of quote unquote pragmatists in the first few years, they sowed the seeds for frustration under Zuma. Because for someone like Zuma and his supporters, the ANC shouldn't kowtow to the private sector, to private capital, to so-called white monopoly capital that owns all the land in the country, never mind that the government owns over 80% of all the land in the country. That then fed someone like Zuma's administration, where he could say, look, the ANC sold out, let me lead it to where it rightly ought to be. And interestingly, in December last year, he's still a member of the ANC, but he said he's going to support a new party, Umkhonto weSizwe, which was the armed wing of the ANC during the struggle. They've now formed a political party. And it just shows you that he's always sort of grifting and looking for ways to still remain in politics, even though he's in his sort of late 70s now and should actually be in prison. So the various players within the ANC at the moment, I think they're just trying to focus on how much they can extract and how much they can get away with. Just a last point on the sort of, I guess, South African support for the ANC and the fact that the party continues to win majorities in elections. In 94, close to 75%, which in our constitution would have meant they could have changed the constitution on their own without needing to negotiate with anyone else. That has declined, but also the share of voters, voter representation has declined. So in the last election in 2019, it was around 49% of eligible voters voted for the ANC. So that indicates to me, and in the polling that we do at the CRA yearly, we ask South Africans their priorities that they want from government. And always at the top is things like a job, security and safety, dealing with corruption, protecting property rights. At the bottom is things like land reform, dealing with racism, quote unquote, redistributing wealth. So there's a disconnect between the priorities that the government pushes versus what the average South African wants. But that doesn't mean that voters have yet found someone who they prefer of the ANC. So we've got a marked rise in voter abstention that could change this year, but that has been the trend line. But of course, that doesn't absolve voters from their responsibilities, and they can't then just claim, oh, well, the government is acting in a way I don't want. They could have still voted. So we'll see if that changes now going forward.
Yeah. So just a quick follow-up. So the party of the former armed wing of the ANC, you said Zuma is supporting them, and is there any prospect of him like coming back in any way?
So the party, I think, is going to focus on the province of KwaZulu-Natal, which is, in terms of ethnicity, is dominated by Zulu-speaking South Africans, black Zulu-speaking South Africans. Zuma did very well for the ANC in that province, where the ANC didn't really do very well in KZN before his presidency, but he really boosted their support against the Inkatha Freedom Party, who they also had many outright fights with, both during the struggle, especially in the 1980s and 90s, when a lot of violence was committed between the ANC and the IFP. Zuma did well to boost the ANC support there during his presidency. So I think it's a bit of a play on his part to try and shore up his own hand, as it were. Maybe our estimate at the moment is that the ANC might come in just below 50%. So this will be the first time in a national election that the ANC gets under 50%. Then they need maybe 4 or 5 other parties to get back above the 50%. Someone like the MK party could give them 2 or 3%, and Zuma in return will demand concessions around, never threaten me with court again. You can see what I can do to you. I demand X, Y, and Z. So I think there's an element of that. He is campaigning on name recognition, his brand. He has said he's not against the ANC. He sees the MK party as the vehicle to save the ANC, the real, make the ANC great again sort of idea. I think he's tapping into that slightly. Whether he still has that influence, I'm not sure of. I think the average South African voter has grown frustrated with his antics and that sort of thing. And I don't think he's going to get the support that he's aiming for. It's also very soon before an election to start a new party and try and really get the ground game going, I think. The elections, at the moment, the date hasn't been declared, but we're looking at maybe May or June. And I think 6 months out is maybe a bit too close to really think that you're going to make a substantial impact.
He's campaigning on name recognition. Jesus Christ, it's one of those things. That's one of those all publicity is good publicity on steroids. Marco.
Yeah, just to fill a few of the gaps here, South Africa has got 12 recognized languages, official languages, which reflect the nature of tribal unity that South Africa represents. Even the flag is supposed to be a wink at the number of tribes in South Africa. And Chris earlier mentioned that the Zulus. Zuma is a Zulu. And the Zulu tribe, which controls a good chunk of the east of South Africa. Does it go as far as Joburg? I'm not sure. Yeah, it does. It was the control of the Zulus was instrumental in the control of South Africa, because these guys are not shy in showing what they want and showing it. Recently, the leader of the Zulu tribe died. It was at no loggerhead as such, but it wasn't getting on too well with Mandela. Nevertheless, the ANC managed to manage them in a way that they wouldn't cause trouble. Now, of course, when Zuma became president, being a Zulu, he knew how to use them to his advantage. So I consider probably that area is probably the most deprived in South Africa. Johannesburg is constantly in the news because of violence, because of tragedy happening. For example, one famous thing is that there are government-owned buildings which have been abandoned, and criminal gang effectively rent out the flats which have been left empty to people. And of course, this is totally illegal, and they don't care about health and safety and all this kind of stuff. And so recently, 77 people died in a fire which occurred in one of these buildings. And then, but the big irony, I think, the big finger in the eye of the people in South Africa was when the BRICS meeting last August was held on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Effectively, you have all these crooks meeting outside Johannesburg, just in the shade of the people of South Africa who are really, really struggling because of all this thieving going on.
I think when it comes to the different electoral results that you're going to see and have already seen in some areas, you've got the Western Cape, which seems to be really quite different in terms of how it votes. And that's probably the big exception to the rest of the country in not going for the ANC. In fact, there are even calls, I understand, for independence for the Western Cape. But the problem is affected by or the difficulty is affected by the whole of South Africa, isn't it? I mean, when infrastructure like the Durban port, for example, is blocked for ages, as it was last year, with tens of thousands of containers unable to get in because of poor maintenance by the Port Authority, then that's going to have a knock-on effect whichever region of the country you live in. And even voting for a different government or becoming separate is not going to solve that. So is the Western Cape a bubble within South Africa, and how artificial is that in terms of how people within it look at the whole country? Because I suspect a lot of the people that we're getting in terms of the chat and talking about South Africa as a country as opposed to what they think possibly come from the Western Cape. Maybe I'm speculating there, but and there's a very different perception as to how the country is, how safe it is because of that sort of protected area.
Chris, yeah.
Yeah, even Cape Town, there's quite a lot of gang warfare in the Cape, in the so-called Cape Flats. So that is a feature. But on average, things like service delivery, trying to deal with crime is at least a bit more. The government and the municipality is more proactive than they are in the rest of the country. Where I'm in Johannesburg, we might be on our 10th mayor this year. In the last 2 years, the sort of city council is various coalitions the whole time between the ANC, the EFF. Parties like Al Jamaah, quite a strong pro-Islamist party. At this point, the previous mayor of South Africa was of Johannesburg was from that party. So Johannesburg and Durban, which all things considered are the economic drivers of the country, of economic activity. Johannesburg still with a lot of mining, Durban with the trade and the ports, also Richards Bay, which is more on the east coast of South Africa. Those ought to be the real drivers of economic activity. But over the last 5 years, those with the means to are moving to the Western Cape and Cape Town, if not to be there permanently, but sort of this idea of semi-grating. So they might still work at times in Johannesburg or Durban, but maybe they're buying homes in the Western Cape, that kind of thing, because on average, the governance is better. And the Western Cape is governed by the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is the official opposition in South Africa, getting between usually 22 to 25%. In elections, the party went through a period of instability and trouble a few years ago where they tried to play a bit more into at least the rhetoric and perception of identity politics and trying to use the right language and all that sort of thing. But they seem to have returned a bit now to their core classical liberal principles. There are still concessions and pragmatic issues here and there, as there would be with any politician, I suppose. So we can't demand, maybe we should demand perfection, but we can't always expect it. The DA has gone into a service delivery focused agreement with the Inkatha Freedom Party in KZN, where Durban is. So you're seeing agreements between a party like the DA, which has shown it can govern and do well in terms of service delivery, with other political parties around the country, where it is trying to tell voters, at least in terms of your basic quality of life, they've got a better track record than the ANC government does. But even there, over the weekend, the ANC held their latest conference, their latest anniversary conference, and what they call their 8th of January statement that they publish every year. President Ramaphosa focused on the last 30 years of performance and no longer looking forward, on sort of promising things like solving blackouts or solving the water issues, or solving unemployment. It's now campaigning on sort of a history. So it's up to parties like the DA, IFB, can they offer that sort of compelling vision, I think, for South Africans to tap into. But just lastly, on the sort of differences between the Western Cape and the rest of the country, there are points where you can drive between the provinces and you can see the quality of the roads and the potholes on one side versus how well it is maintained on the other. So those things, I think, are maintained somewhat well. There are still pockets of performance around the rest of the country where municipalities are performing better. There's one municipality in KwaZulu-Natal where the mayor is from the Democratic Alliance. I think he's maybe in his early 30s, he's gay, and he speaks Zulu fluently, but he's white. So he speaks Zulu and English fluently, and it's sort of this interesting combo of maybe that South African, rainbow nation dream that is realized in this one particular individual, where he shows the principles of the party are correct, and he also can govern in that way. So that could be one of the most effective ways to convince people to vote for the DA going forward. I think those people who are able to, if they have to stay in places like Johannesburg, Durban, places outside the Western Cape, they are doing things like installing solar panels, private water collection facilities, so they protect themselves from some element of state failure. Private security officers, at last count, some of our data indicated private security officers are over 500,000 in South Africa, where police officers are around maybe 150,000 to 200,000. So the reliance on private security all of those things where maybe regardless of what happens in the elections and regardless of where you live in the country, to build some sense of resistance to the failures of the state where your resources can account for that.
Yeah. Chris, do you think that the government from the DA in the Western Cape can be translated across the whole country, or do you think they're going to struggle trying to keep the cohesion of the country itself?
I think they can. There's a bit of a campaigning issue around, I think, a lack of maybe charismatic leaders and sort of animating leaders. I can again sort of lean on our own polling. When we poll different political representatives and leaders around the country, our latest polling we did in October last year, people like President Ramaphosa, Julius Malema, former President Zuma, they're much more popular and known versus someone like John Steenhuisen, who is the leader of the Democratic Alliance, where he's been the leader for a few years now, but there's not that vigor around him, or that sort of, I don't know, charisma or getting voters, sort of bought in kind of thing. So the principles are there, the policies are there, the plans for reform, how can we reform the social grant system, for example, the welfare system, without upending everything overnight. So the DA isn't going to try and pretend to be, I don't know, anarcho-capitalist, not that's a contradiction in terms, anarchists, and then try and, upend everything overnight. They're trying to be a bit more pragmatic, leaning, trying to push things in a classically liberal direction. I think it's sort of translating the ideas and the resources and the know-how that you have to the average South African. The ANC has done very well to campaign on this idea of they delivered South Africa from apartheid, and if you vote for any other party, we're going to return to apartheid. Social grants will be removed, everything will be privatized, you'll live off R5 a day kind of thing, you'll stand in lines for bread. There's a bit of that fear, I think, and a bit of maybe Stockholm syndrome, where you just, I don't know, you've been beaten into submission and you know the devil, and you're going to stick with that. But with that being said, that element of voter abstention to me tells me that even there are sort of ways where the opposition parties can tap into that frustration with the ANC. If they can just, it's maybe combining the good ideas, the rational part of these policies will work. We've shown it in terms of theory and practice. How do you combine that with an emotional message to get people out and turn out?
Yeah, I was also thinking about the Stockholm syndrome, and I was looking up one of the videos I watched recently showed the riots when Zuma was ousted. People, his supporters were rioting, and I was thinking, how bad does it have to get for people to say, okay, maybe this leader we supported, we shouldn't have supported, and I see this in our chat when I criticize Netanyahu. And people who are on the pro-Israel side, claim that he's a good leader. We still have people wanting Trump back. People have Stockholm syndrome for bad leaders. But I wanted to ask, just generally in South African society, for those of us who aren't familiar, how tribalistic is it compared to Western societies, compared to South Africa? During apartheid, and how much of whatever tribalism there is, how much of it is racial?
I think in more urban settings where people maybe have to work together to try and resolve some of the many challenges that the failing state is imposing on them, there's a steady shift to where we just want things to work. We want the best people appointed for the job. We want our sports teams appointed on merit. We want to perform on the world stage, and the best way to do that is by getting the right people in the room. The South African rugby team, the Springboks, in winning the World Cup last year, if one wants to reduce it to crude, racialism, a very diverse team. With that being said, every player was there on merit and could perform. So how they managed to do that is something that maybe could be looked at in other avenues as well, and sort of emulated. I'm not sure if you're all aware of the story of the captain of the under-19 cricket team and what happened with him. So you've got pockets of where things work, but then other places where the sort of crass racialism still carries through. So I think in urban areas, there's an element of maybe more melding of ideas and cultures way past just crude racial lines, even sort of income, that kind of thing. From 94 up until now, there's been progress in things like building an economy that is more open, where people have more opportunities, that sort of thing. But with things like patronage, it's ensured that inequality, for example, between Black South Africans, between poorer and richer Black South Africans, has increased because it's become a case of patronage. So it just happens to be so who you get that ahead. And that's the sort of inequality that you get when you've got collectivist status systems. It's that entrenched inequality that isn't the consequence of people's ingenuity or the free market or anything like that. It's a consequence of state action and preferential contracts and that sort of thing. So that's an element to try and deal with. I think in more rural areas, even there where in the past it was maybe more drawn along racial lines, even there where smaller towns are falling apart faster than bigger cities where there's less resources, you've got farmers, communities, civil society groups, just trying to find solutions to all the challenges the state is imposing on them and trying to find some sort of element of how they can work together. So I think despite maybe how easy it is for the media to portray certain incidents as indicative of the trend, we don't see it in daily life, and we don't see it, again, to refer to the polling where our organization and others look at racial attitudes. And on average, when asked, have you experienced racism in the last 5 years? Do you want to work with people of different races? Respondents generally go for, we want to work together. We think South Africa can work best when there's more individual and economic freedom. And I think that's something gratifying. It's not a guarantee that it will always be there. I think there's definitely an opportunity for a more populist figure in South Africa, given the high unemployment, given the frustrations, to maybe rise up and say, don't worry about your civil liberties. We'll give you 10% economic growth like China did, but you won't have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and media and that sort of thing. I think that could be on the cards post 2024 if we don't see some kind of change in the elections this year. But for now, I think, despite the many reasons that there could be for strong conflict between race groups, call it that, one doesn't really see that. It's maybe more intra-race group violence versus inter-race groups.
So just very quickly, because I think the three of us have heard the story of the captain of the youth cricket team from last week, but do you want to quickly repeat it for anybody in our audience who might not know about it?
Sure. So David Teager, he was the captain of the South African under-19 cricket team. The under-19 Cricket World Cup tournament is being hosted in South Africa, starting, I think, this week or maybe next week, pretty soon. But last year, he received an award for being a rising star, performing very well. And in part of his speech, and I'm paraphrasing, he wanted to dedicate the award to members and soldiers in the Israeli Defense Force for how they were responding to the Hamas attack on the 7th of October. That caused maybe not as much backlash as one would have expected, but maybe that should have sent signals to keep an eye on this. So over the last week, it was announced that he was asked to step down as captain, and then he did so because of quote-unquote security concerns. That Cricket South Africa had received reports that there would be protests and violence at the venues where the team was going to play at this under-19 Cricket World Cup tournament, and they did that to protect him, I guess, and the team. Interestingly enough, he is still part of the team, so I'm not sure how exactly that deals with the particular security concern. He's still going to be there. And also some reports in an Afrikaans newspaper, in Rapport, the biggest Afrikaans newspaper in the country, over the weekend. Those reports indicated that a minister had met with Cricket South Africa and with the team last week on Monday or Tuesday, tried to sort of motivate the team kind of thing. That was part of his address, but also talked to the board about David Teager and the issue around his comments, etc., maybe an element there of political pressure, which, given the track record of political interference in sporting bodies, in state companies, in private sector companies, I think the burden of proof is on the government to sort of maybe refute that kind of thing.
Marco.
I think I feel quite positive about some of the things you said. For example, the way the people in South Africa deal with the failure of the state in provide energy, again, shows that individuals left free to pursue their own needs and trade with other people can get around the state and can get rid of the burden and the hassle and the pain provided by the state. And also, I'm quite happy about the way you mentioned people are not being tribalistic among each other, and they collaborate with each other, and that's so much more positive than the image you usually get from the media, where it's all about interracial, intertribe violence and all this kind of stuff. And it's good to hear, definitely good to hear. On the other hand, you're involved with a think tank to promote freedom, aren't you? How do you find the penetration in the society in South Africa about liberal ideas and ideas about freedom and getting rid of the state? Because the ANC kind of is quite communist in its propaganda, isn't it? So how is that perceived?
So one of the, I guess, avenues that really benefits us is how much we use data and different sources to both for our own clients, but also maybe in some of our public advocacy, where we can show the consequences of ideology and policies, how policies are downstream from ideology. If you have a certain worldview of maybe the role of the state should play, for example, you are necessarily going to see certain consequences. It's not an accident that you have state capture, which in South Africa was this period under the Jacob Zuma presidency of mass corruption and looting of public companies. That's not an accident that these things happen. It's a necessary outcome of your sort of ideology. So when one can point to the data and show how more statist, more controlling, more collectivist policies and implementation thereof have led to negative consequences, you can show both in the theory for moral reasons, but also for practical reasons, why it doesn't deliver on what it promises. It's always going to be vapid and empty. It's not going to deliver what it tries to sell to the world. So there is, I think, a rising desire for these sorts of answers and new different ways of looking at things, where the status quo has been the government must, if there's a problem, surely the government must solve it, regardless of what it is. If it's lack of electricity, let's create another state-owned company to compete with this one, but let's not open up the market to private sector players, for example. That's always the desire. I think in the media, which is broadly the biggest papers are maybe somewhat center to center left leaning. Even there, you're seeing a willingness to publish think pieces, opinions from different viewpoints, be wanting to rely on us for things like data analysis, that sort of thing, where it's reputable, it's reliable. They won't always agree with our outcomes, but at least then you have another platform to sort of try and speak with people and influence those who are watching, not necessarily who you're debating, but other people. In the universities, I think it's decidedly more difficult. They're the easiest, I guess, attack against people in classical liberal think tanks broadly is that, oh, you're just importing American talking points, you're a Trumpist. It's very sort of lazy lumping together, I suppose. If anyone knows anything about Donald Trump and his economic policies, I don't think even he would consider himself a classical liberal, but I guess that's another thing for another issue for another day. In the universities, it is more difficult. Their identity politics is quite strong. So there's maybe an opportunity for think tanks to try and deal with that. How do we deal with that? To try and influence the public universities so that students who come out at least are exposed to some different ideas. In the corporate world, I think the mounting frustrations with the government are leading them to want different analysis from what they've been presented before. Not necessarily to be told everything is fine. What are the issues? Why did we get here? And how can we get out of it, sort of thing. So trying to look for solutions. So I think there are gaps here and there, not as much as we would want yet. but they are here and there. And also, lastly, some opposition parties, they're also open to different analysis, getting different perspectives. Not all of them always push everything, maybe in different language than we might use, for example. So they're not going to use, I don't know, they won't talk about capitalism in moral terms. They'll talk about, maybe letting the market be somewhat free is best for all concerned. So still an underlying sense of collectivism, but it's here and there. I think it's creeping in.
Richard?
I wanted to say something possibly a bit controversial, or at least that risks pissing off some of the people listening if my language hasn't already done so. I want to flip the question around a little bit and looking at South Africans versus South Africa. And I'm not talking here about the looters and the moochers. I'm talking about the good people of South Africa, the better people of South Africa, and some of the ideologies and thinking that they've bought into, which is perhaps assisting in the demise of the country without them realizing it. For example, I mean, some of it's more obvious, some of it we've touched on. For example, to some people, to some extent, to different extents, of course, when they're faced with things like affirmative action, racism can come out, and racism is not the answer to racism. Reason is. When it comes to religion, people, it's obviously quite religious in many ways, and people double down on the Christianity. And again, religion isn't the answer to the influx of another religion. Reason is. And one of the legacies of religion and Christianity is the doctrine of altruism itself, and the fact that the thinking of love thy neighbor, even love thy enemy, leads to the morality of parasitism, which then affects the whole country and the whole population as a whole. And then also one thing I do notice is a sense of the different standards when talking to South Africans. South Africans over in South Africa will talk about Britain, and they'll have quite a good knowledge of what's going on in the UK, for example. And they'll say something like, "Isn't it terrible that X happened yesterday?" And you go, "Well, what are you talking about? You need to be accompanied after dark in order to get home without being stabbed. Or you can't break down on the street without risk of being carjacked or whatever," and those kind of things. The different standards that, yes, well, it's Africa, and we shrug it off, or they shrug it off as if it's a man-made thing, as if it's in the earth or the air, or the nature of the karma for the past, or whatever kind of reason is offered for the fact that it's unchangeable. So I guess what I'm asking is and I realize this depends on where you live across South Africa, but if the avoidance of things like violence and theft is top of mind all the time, or really should be for certain people in certain areas, then for the young people, why stay? I mean, is it an allegiance to country? Is it an allegiance to how the country once was, to an attempt to regain the glories of the past? Or is it some sort of sacrifice along those lines? I mean, I realize a good number of people are leaving the country, and that is obviously has its own brain drain effect. But to many young people, if I were speaking to them, I would ask them, well, why are you still there?
I think it could be a combination of things. So it's sort of familial ties, wanting to be there for one's parents, maybe one's grandparents, that kind of thing. In 2024, a lot of it, the cause behind it could be purely economic, where if you don't receive some kind of very above average or high paying job offer in the UK or the US, it's just too expensive, for example, to go somewhere like that, given the depreciation of our currency. So you might get an opportunity, but if you don't have a secure job, you can maybe only be in one of those countries for a month or so, and then you have to come back in any case. There's a strong element of lifestyle, despite the problems, the sort of wildlife, natural beauty, different things to do in a country that isn't that difficult to travel through. From Johannesburg to Cape Town might take you 10, 11 hours by car. Of course, you can fly across the country, so there's lots to see, oceans, mountains, all that kind of thing. The culture point, I think, maybe feeds into that, and it's trite. I've said this in many of our client briefings, but that resilience on the part of South Africans, where this idea of if you're able to and you want, maybe for the right reasons, to stay in South Africa, you can build a pretty good life and not move somewhere else and then have to deal and learn about the troubles and the issues there and spend time dealing with those. So you've built up an element of resilience, I think, and state proofing yourself. So rather deal with issues you have here. Of course, not if it becomes sort of ungovernable and all that kind of thing, then you're still going to look for ways out. But there's maybe that element of, you know how things work here. People are on average friendly. When you interact with people in the shops, all that kind of thing, when you move around, yes, there is crime. I'm not going to try and discount that. I mean, very high levels of crime compared to other places. But if you know sort of how to, I guess, go about yourself, your daily life, don't, sort of talk on your phone like this, small things, then you're still going to be okay. That doesn't mean it's right and that it should be accepted, but you sort of, I guess, get used to it to some extent. What you mentioned at the start, I just want to also highlight where it could be among South Africans and also people elsewhere, South Africans who have moved elsewhere, where they'll say, oh, it's just Africa, or that sort of attitude, especially among South Africans. To me, that element of the bigotry of low expectations and thinking, oh, well, this is the country's history, this is just what we deal with, this is all that we deserve, kind of thing. That, a bit of victim, I guess, mentality and victimhood, that's a big question and issue, how we start to shift the needle on that. That can maybe only happen with time. But even there, as you've seen the slow but sure decline of the state, what we call in some ways the inefficient, not inefficient, the sort of ineffective state, where it wants to be developmental, it wants to run state-owned companies, it wants to transform the economy. It doesn't have the skills or the money or the capacity to do that. So people just ignore it. In Gauteng, for example, in my home province, they installed various gantries on the highways, and they scan your license plates and then collect additional sort of levies and fines on that. People just don't install the license discs anymore that system needs. So it's supposed to be a legal requirement, but people just ignore it. And I think maybe that kind of attitude you don't get in many other countries, and it's kind of nice to see when you've got silly policies and laws, then that the average citizen, they don't realize they're doing it, but maybe they're already implementing some of the things that we want, just in a way that they sort of understand and see.
Yeah, by the way, in London, you can't talk on your phone on the street either, and it's not okay. Yeah, but anyway, unfortunately, we're nearly out of time, although I think we could have kept this going. But yeah, I have to ask, so we hear about the influence of Russia, China, maybe to some extent Iran. How bad is it? How much of what we hear is really true? And yeah, what kind of influence do those countries have?
So especially around the time of the Zuma administration and his presidency, South Africa was exploring adding new nuclear power stations. And there was a push from him and his presidency for the Russians, or the Russian government, Russian entities, I guess it's all the same thing at this point, for them to build new nuclear power stations. Civil society, the media, the captured media, whatever one wants to call it, they pushed back against all of that, and the deal was struck aside. Then state capture happened, and you had the hollowing out of the police services, but also the intelligence services. And I wonder about what goes on in the background, that some of which is reported. For example, when the Lady R docked in Simonstown and we had the loading of arms, I mean, that was very well documented by the citizens and by the media. So some of it is documented. I worry about what is not documented. And given what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, in somewhere like Mozambique, with entities linked to ISIS and other sort of more radical Islamist players, when you've got your police services, your intelligence services in South Africa, but also in neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, not really having much capacity to go on, something is going to fill that void. So we wanted to, of course, be private actors where that's possible, but there could be more destructive forces filling that over time, and we see the consequences only when it's too late. I know that's not maybe the most gratifying answer, but I think it could manifest much more negatively over time than it is right now. As I mentioned, there are questions around funding, streams of funding between the ANC and between Iran and Russia. South Africa's Minister for International Relations was in Iran, I think, very close before the 7th of October. That doesn't mean, I'm trying to link the two, but that it happens to be around the same time is not particularly good optics, and why go there in the first place? And then also, why return a phone call from Hamas that took place after the 7th of October? So you've got already doubt in, does the current government really commit to things like democracy, the rule of law? And then you've got these various reports and rumors swirling around. So I'm not going to discount in any way the possibility that there is funding moving from Russia and Iran to South Africa to support the current government, given their own financial troubles. We might see it manifest now in the elections this year, in how opponents are maybe smeared on social media, what actors are going to be at play. I mean, they could probably use X quite well, given the state of that platform. So we'll have to see what happens in that regard. But even there, yeah, I think given the strength of the civil society, of the media, of the average citizen and business, there'll be a very strong pushback against that. I think amongst the average South African, there is an affinity for, quote unquote, the West and Western ideas like democracy, the rule of law, civil rights, that sort of thing. Whether people realize that those things cannot be taken for granted, that they won't always be there if you don't protect them and fight for them, that's another question. But I think
Actually,
those things.
maybe that is the question that I'll ask in the minute or so we have left. Since this is Ayn Rand Center UK, are Ayn Rand's ideas well known? Is she read there? Do people, is there a chance that that is going to be a part of the positive change in South Africa?
I don't think so yet, given the strength of Rand's arguments around morality, why morality needs to underpin, for example, if you're advocating for capitalism, for example, why it needs to be there. So if we get there, it'll be, I guess, a lucky consequence of people pragmatically moving away from statism because it doesn't work. But Rand is not that well known, despite some of our best efforts. Not yet, but we continue in that regard. But for the time being, I think the ground needs to be, the seeds need to be sown quite a lot wider and deeper before we see the fruit of that sort of thing.
Chris, thank you very much for this episode. We will cover South Africa more, certainly around the elections. I think we'll be talking a lot about that. Where can people find out more about you?
Thank you all for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate this and the work that you do. Don't discount what it does for those objectivists around the world and to see these kinds of platforms. So don't underestimate that sort of thing. Just a personal thank you, I guess. In terms of our own work, yeah, I'm on X, I'm on LinkedIn. You can follow me there. If you want to find news data from South Africa, you can also check out the Center for Risk Analysis at our website, cra-sa.com. You can also find us on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Thanks.
Thanks. And Marco and Richard, thank you. Yeah, Marco, despite you claiming that you have nothing to promote, there is something that you guys would like to promote, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're mentioning the other channel of the Ayn Rand Center UK called The Briefly Objective on YouTube, which has lots of edited videos, which are particularly over 30 videos edited on the Israel-Hamas conflict. And many of those are available now for people to view and forward, which succinctly sum up the arguments.
Thanks. I am at Razi Ginsburg on X. Tomorrow on the Daily Objective, I will be interviewing Benjamin Weinthal from the Jerusalem Post about UNRWA's funding from Qatar and what that has to do with the fact they, sorry, not UNRWA, Human Rights Watch, the less militant version of those ideas. But yeah, for some reason, the human rights such organizations seem to care about are only the rights of those who violate the rights of others. We'll be talking about that tomorrow, and we'll be back with another episode of the reality show right after. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.